Hi, okay, so yeah, we're live. Good evening. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the show. Welcome to Connect Africa. Hi, Lambert. How are you?
Hi, Mahlet. I'm okay. How are you?
Good. So here we are again. So our topic for tonight is what happened last week. It was a lot of things going on in one day or over the weekend, even. What happened on October 7 was quite historical. I mean, historical in a sense. It's a day that where we saw where we actually that synchronization, how the West is working together to really destabilize countries that they don't want, or like countries which their leaders are not bowing to the West. Why do I say this? As we all know, the long anticipated peace talk was about to happen over the weekend that just passed. And on 7 October, which is on Friday, we heard that just all one day that one of the facilitator or the panelists of the peace negotiation, uh, the former president Uhuru Kenyatta has pulled out, and then later on we saw also with the Mike Hammer, the U.S. Special Envoy for the region, meaning for the Horn of Africa, has been touring the region, not really specifically the region, but like South Africa, where the peace talk was supposed to happen, and then Kenya. It was just a lot, and then later on the day, the 51st Human Rights Council meeting has ended its meeting by adopting the proposal to renew the mandate of the International Commission Human Rights experts on Ethiopia. So what a bashing, all in one day. But we are here specifically to discuss, the pulling out of Uhuru Kenyatta. There has been many, the news that's coming from Kenya and others from the outside has been saying it's something that's coordinated with the US, as also the TPLF propagandists. Am I right? Did I say it correctly?
Yes,
Has been
propagandist.
saying, and but the internal news from Kenya says there has been a drift between the two, namely President Ruto and Kenyatta. In all this, what's your take, Lambert?
Thank you, Mahlet, again. Thank you for this opportunity to discuss this matter. I have said I said this from the I've been emphasizing the same thing from the very start. I kept thinking and saying that at no one point, since the conflict in Ethiopia began, and the US led West demonstrated and showed to which side between the two warring parties of the TPLF and the government of Ethiopia that they support. At no point within the interval since the war began have I been convinced that it is in the best interest of the US to have peace return in Ethiopia. So I've always thought whatever talk that the US talks, whatever they keep talking about peace and all that, I've been thinking they can only be interested in anything to do with peace if at the end of the day it leaves them and the TPLF in a much stronger position to continue to destabilize Ethiopia. Because if we all agree, for instance, as I do, of course, that the US has been backing the TPLF, I think it's no longer a secret to anybody who has followed the conflict from day one. If it is true that the US has been backing the TPLF, and you've seen how they've tried, the way they've engaged, I think we don't need to discuss. It's by now clear that the TPLF has had its side. I mean, the US has been backing the TPLF. Now, if that is true, under what circumstances would the US, what has changed in that interval that would convince the US that it's time for peace to return?
Mm-hmm.
If anything, there is a much easier way for the US play a part in peace coming back to Ethiopia. And it's as simple as withdrawing its support from the TPLF and offering its support wholesomely to the government of Ethiopia. That is the easiest way for peace to come back. I do not think, I have said this before, that the TPLF has the manpower, that the TPLF has the capacity to sustain war for over 1 year independently. Because if you have followed the Russian war, by the way, Mahlet, you've seen they kept saying that Russia has run out of ammunition. Well, true or not true, but the point here is that no, it is difficult to sustain war for a long time. And Russia has been in this war for less than about 6 months, I think. Now, now TPLF has been in war for now over a year. And if you look at TPLF and Russia produces its own weaponry. How come that TPLF has been able to sustain this war? The point I'm making is that the only chance that TPLF has been able to keep up over 1 year and keep fighting is that it has supply of weaponry, it has support, coming in for itself. Now, if that's the case, the question becomes, where does this support come from? Like I said, we go back to the beginning, and we have to accept that the TPLF has the support of some powers, either outside Ethiopia, not either, it's outside Ethiopia, and that's the US, and of course it is satellite routes within the region, Egypt and Sudan. Now, what has changed ever since the US began supporting the TPLF? So that by this point now, the US is willing to have peace. The point I'm making, Mahlet, is that I do not think that at this particular point in time, it is in the interest of the US that peace returns to Ethiopia. Like I said, the easiest way they could ensure that peace comes back is as simple as withdrawing their support from the TPLF and offering more of it to the government of Ethiopia, or even leaving the government of Ethiopia to deal with the TPLF on its own. I do not think that the TPLF can actually, militarily take on the government of Ethiopia for over 1 year, even if they were left on their own. So I do not think, even when these peace talks, talk of peace talks, began being raised, they kept thinking there has to be peace talks. I kept asking myself, how genuine is this? I mean, I kept wondering, how genuinely interested is the US in these peace talks? And I'm thinking, how does it meet the interest of the US? Because personally, I've always thought that the support of the US and other foreign powers for TPLF is premised on the fact that they want a balancing force within Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa. And the government of Prime Minister Abiy has not seemed to be that friendly, and in the play of geopolitics within the region. The government of Ethiopia doesn't seem to be so subservient to the US. And they want somebody to keep the government of Ethiopia on check. They need something they can trigger and keep telling you that if you're not going to listen to us, we're going to do this. And the TPLF serves that interest. Now, what has changed in the last 2-3 months that the US would finally begin to support peace? I have said at the beginning that while I support, a peaceful end to this conflict, I also have a part of me which believes that for it to end sustainably, perhaps the most likely way is a military solution. Of course, I would prefer that it is negotiated, but I believe that one of the two warring parties must be completely defeated or must completely surrender, and that can only be the TPLF. So the withdrawal of President Uhuru from the peace talks for me wasn't a big surprise. I would have actually been surprised if they had gone ahead with it. First of all, the very involvement of President Uhuru himself in these peace talks, for me, was quite of challenging from the beginning, because President Uhuru's presidency, for me, from the start, has been associated with the kind of being the policeman of the outside forces within the region. So when it was brought in, I thought it's being brought in to serve the interests and perhaps be the on-site, person for the powers that be outside Ethiopia. So that is perhaps in a nutshell what I could say on that, Mahlet.
Thank you, Lambert, for that. Just to comment on what you said, what has changed for the US now that in this last month or we have heard it was during the annual peace, what was happening in UN, the annual thing where the leaders meet, that the UN said the usual, what we know, there was nothing new, but President Biden said that, okay, like we support the AU-led negotiation to resolve that conflict. But like everybody was laughing, okay, what new did you propose? I mean, don't we know that? Isn't this what Ethiopia has been saying all along? So, but of course, they knew that with the presentation that has been made by the foreign minister of Ethiopia on that conference, they have been told, and they knew that Ethiopia was really, they came prepared. Another thing that is given to as an answer for that was what has changed is especially the last visit. I don't know, like maybe a couple of months ago, the time could be really bad, but it's not really far. The foreign minister of Russia has made a tour in Africa, and one of the country was actually Ethiopia. And after that, different analysts say that actually the tone has been changing, and they think that really not only Ethiopia, they feel like, I mean, the West, led by the US, has lost that region, and they know that anything what Ethiopia do has the capacity to mobilize the region and the continent. So those are the things that are talked around it. While of course you have your reaction to that, I will come back to you. Welcome, Kwame. We have our other speaker here who just joined us a bit late, but I'm sure you didn't miss much. Welcome to the to Connect Africa, or to the show again.
Thank you very much, Mahlet. Greetings to you, my brother Lambert.
Greetings.
And greetings to the audience. It's such an interesting topic and very, very exciting.
Yeah, so you, just like Lambert, I mean, for the audience, for anyone who has been following at Connect Africa knows that Lambert and Kwame are two Pan-Africanist brothers, friend of the show. Actually, they're family. And, whenever we can, at least once weekly, we do analyze what's happening in the continent. But of course, a lot's happening in Ethiopia, so much of the topics could be Ethiopia. But yeah, now coming to you, Kwame, you has been, of course, closely following what's happening in Ethiopia for the last 2 years, and where everybody was excited, and that finally this AU-led negotiation is going to resume. October 1st, all of a sudden, the African Union has dropped this not verbal in public, saying that it's going to resume the peace talk on Ethiopia, and it will be led the Obasanjo, which was, of course, in the first place, it was led by him. But additionally, they said the not verbal included that Uhuru Kenyatta will be there as a facilitator / panelist. Now, on 7th October, just a day before of the negotiation, Uhuru Kenyatta has pulled out, and a lot has happened. There are decorations around it. And the day before, the current president of Kenya was in Ethiopia. Tell us, what was your take of this?
First of all, thank you very much. Can you hear me very well?
Yeah.
Very loud and clear. Yeah.
Excellent. When you look at how the conflict started and how African people responded to this situation, it is very credible. It is one of the things which showed that if we have strong leaders on the continent, determined leaders and strong leaders who are willing to defend the dignity of the Africans, the people on the continent themselves are willing to back those leaders and protect them. And this is what Prime Minister Abiy, from my understanding, has been doing. That he has stood, strong amidst all the opposition from these imperialists, and the people were able to back him up. The Ethiopian diaspora, the Ethiopians within the country itself. And he himself also was able to mobilize his government, mobilize the resources, the media within to attack. So it was a collective effort, and it was a successful one. And the people did this all. Let us first of all remind ourselves that this attack started with the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam that was being completed because Egypt was protesting against the dam, a few years before the TPLF, broke out, that rebellion broke out. Egypt was protesting against the dam, and then we see Trump making some reckless remarks that Egypt will come and blow up the dam, and bomb it and stuff like that. And then all of a sudden TPLF, breaks out as a rebellion. And, to some people who are forward-looking like us, who are Pan-Africans, we don't see this as a coincidence. We don't see this as an accident. But all in all, the Prime Minister has been able to stand firm, and the people were able also to mobilize and defend the country. The other Africans have been able to defend the country. The African Union has always, we expected more from it. We expected it to react, and come to the defense and speak with the same voice as the African people, as African civil society, and what it is saying. But as always, we know its problems. The African Union is an non-interventionist organization, is sort of like an NGO. Even some NGOs from the Western world, they interfere much more in the affairs of the African continent, even much more than the African Union itself, which belongs here. So it is surprising to a certain level. So the African Union doesn't interfere much into the affairs, but nevertheless, it was able to, organize itself, appoint President Obasanjo, and all that. So where we have reached, I can say that it has contributed slightly, but I think most of the work has been done, by the regional countries and the African civil society itself, the Ethiopian people. And so it is necessary that we empower it, of course, as the African Union, as it is. It's necessary that we empower it so that it should be able to do the work and represent us. But there is certain elements from which it is supposed to disconnect itself, and it has not disconnected. Elements like the neo-colonial, enterprises, and admitting countries like Israel, which are committing genocide in Palestine, admitting them as observers. So this becomes problematic. So what I'm trying to say is that African Union itself needs to reflect, reflect upon itself and what it is doing, whether this is what is expected of it, or it is not what is expected of it, and it needs to step up. The leadership needs to step up their game so that they represent the African continent, the African people, in their entirety, so that the African people are not tossed here and there like balls. The Europeans keep mentioning reckless words and pushing us here and there. So this conflict, which I've mostly referred to as a rebellion, I think that the Prime Minister Abiy and the government in Ethiopia has handled it with a lot of wisdom, with a lot of care, and with the he has been a parent. The Prime Minister has been a parent to this nation. He has behaved like a very loving parent, because if the government wanted to go and crush the TPLF, it would have achieved that within a very short period. Because remember, on the other side, we have Eritrea. These guys, they can't run anywhere. If the Prime Minister said that he's going to crush them, within 1 or 2 weeks. So he has behaved like really a responsible parent, that he doesn't want to shed blood in the country. And so he needs commendation as much as the people needs to be commended who have stood up, and the African people and the Ethiopian people, the Prime Minister also needs to be commended for the effort. When these negotiations were announced that they're going to happen in South Africa, I was very excited about it. I was excited, reason being that they were organized by the African Union, and the people who are going to lead these negotiations are also Africans, President Uhuru Kenyatta and President Obasanjo. So I saw this as a victory for us as Africans, and a victory on the side of Ethiopia itself, because the Prime Minister Abiy has been calling for an African solution. He has consistently rejected the interference of the United Nations in these affairs. If it wants to give aid in form of food and all those things that it gives, but the United Nations should not cross into African affairs. So the Prime Minister has consistently said that this is an African issue and it should be handled by Africans. African solutions to African problems consistently ever since this rebellion started by this group called the TPLF. And so when the African Union took it up and said they are organizing this negotiation, this peace negotiation, and it is being facilitated by Uhuru Kenyatta and President Obasanjo, who was appointed definitely by the African Union, I think that it was a victory for us. But then, to me, when I heard that President Uhuru Kenyatta is pulling out, I felt a blow. I even myself felt a little bit confused, because I thought that we are winning. TPLF has been cornered. They tried to coerce Kenya. President Ruto, when he was in New York, they tried to coerce him. He met Blinken and met all these guys. They tried to coerce him, but he was not able to give in. And so it puts question marks for me on President Uhuru Kenyatta and his intentions, because I thought that this is a time, since that he has retired as a president, this is the time for him and President Obasanjo to play a very important role in stabilizing the continent and to cement their legacy as African statesmen, so that he would not go down as a Kenyan statesman, but rather as an African statesman. So that means making a continental contribution to the continent. So if President Uhuru Kenyatta pulls out of these negotiations, even when President Ruto is still in Kenya, President Ruto, who appointed him, to continue these negotiations since he started the policy, and in the past, Kenya has been vocal in defending. Kenya has been vocal in defending Ethiopia. You remember that in 2021, when Blinken came to Kenya, the then government of President Uhuru made it clear that it doesn't agree with interference in the region in Ethiopia, because Blinken had come there to try to convince. So these are all the scenarios on which I had banked on, and I saw that Africa is winning. But then it became a very big disappointment when I heard that President Uhuru pulled out of these negotiations. But as Africans, I think that we should not be, very much weakened, but we should rather look around and find another solutions. We should take on, put on our gown of optimism and continue to look for other solutions. But I think that if it is missing it, I think that President Uhuru Kenyatta has missed it, that he had an opportunity to cement his legacy as one of the great leaders on this continent, one of of those great leaders who have been on this continent after leaving after leaving the presidential seat in Kenya, there's no better way for an African to serve. There's no better place for an African to serve other than the African continent. You can't say that you will go and serve at the UN and be considered a great African. I think this was the best opportunity for him to cement his legacy as a great, African statesman. So this was my observation from these scenarios that happened. But I think that we should continue to be optimistic and look for other solutions to this problem.
Thank you, Kwame, for that. Yeah, to say the least, we were all appalled. But there were some signs. I couldn't say that I was totally surprised, but the fact that there was no complaint or there was nothing up until the very last day kind of made me, oh, okay, like we are on the right way, and nobody's going to pull out. We are in the situation, I mean, as an Ethiopian now I'm talking, where we can, yes, Kenya, just to reflect on what you said, Kwame. Indeed, Kenya has been, I even made a short video about it. I mean, regardless of what happened, it's not going to be judged by Kenya, but as an individual, as the former president, Uhuru Kenyatta, because we have seen a lot in defending Ethiopia consistently for the past, nearly 2 years by now. As you said, it was actually a year ago exactly when US, by the way, since the conflict started, has changed a lot of special envoy for the region. So it's this much they are concerned. So at that time, it was Anthony Blinken, and he was doing a tour in November 2021, I remember, to talk about Ethiopia, but alienating Ethiopia. And he was going Kenya, Senegal, and Nigeria. So his first stop was Kenya. So Uhuru Kenyatta slammed him because Kenya is, of course, accused of for being, how do you say, a hotbed for those so-called experts and researchers who are releasing articles day after day and then doing their news by saying, oh, they are from their region. So because they were accused for that, they say, like, stop doing that. He told them quite on their face. And also we have seen their cabinet secretary, Ambassador Rachel Omamo, and then we have seen that now continued, that legacy by President Ruto. But of course, we cannot say that. I mean, it's like a time where we can tell a tale of two presidents and then a tale of two ladies, because on the other hand, we have also a Kenyan woman who's leading the International Commission human rights experts on Ethiopia. So it's like when you see Morina Cheng, who actually told the truth to a journalist what's going on in Ethiopia and was expelled by the UN from her position. She was working for UNIOM in Ethiopia. And then you have Kerry Muringi, who did that, who was heading and, disseminating that false information in front of the UN. And then we have now President Uhuru and President Kenyatta. Now, my question is, let's be very specific now and, and try to anticipate what's going to happen and what are, the options. Up until now, as far as my understanding and as per my reading, I haven't seen any statements that came out from the African Union regarding this. So, but the West are already busy talking about, the US has took over, and then, this needs kind of intervention. Like if we have seen the report from the European Union, a 4-page report already, usually they tell you through the article, they report what they want to do. And it's already talking about, the Arabs, the Middle East and Russia can involve in the peace talk, as if to make Ethiopia is siding only to those, and Ethiopia is kind of hating on the West. But they are putting an important phrase which says, Welkite, which is a much disputed place, should be given to the region Tigray. I mean, who are they to tell so? So now the West, the European Union, the US are already making their assumptions or telling us what's going to happen. On the other hand, the owner of the issue, the African Union, is saying nothing. So
yeah, I think
let me finish. Sorry, Kwame. So now
okay.
the letter of the from Uhuru Kenyatta that he wrote to the African Union, actually not only he pulled out, now he's demanding the questions that were requested by the TPLF. So what are like the likely scenarios going to happen? He says if there is a change date, that's going to be assigned by the commission. In this stake, what are the likely scenarios that are going to happen, or what should even the African Union should do? Of course, it's not for us to speak on behalf of the African Union, but
yeah, definitely. I think that the African Union, even though we can't speak on behalf of it, but we are citizens of this continent, so we have expectations. So those expectations as African citizens, I think, have to be respected and have to be met. Let me go back to what you started with. This Madam Murundi from Kenya, who is on the Human Rights Watch, that committee which was formed to monitor and keep an eye on Ethiopia and coerce Ethiopia, of course. I really don't think that she represents the Kenyan government. She represents, I think, herself, her own interests. I don't really think she represents the Kenyan people when she carries out these activities with a foreign body that is known to interfere in Africa and destabilize the African continent. So I think that this is a self-serving adventure which she is carrying out with the enemies of the continent who are there to destabilize the continent and weaponize, because many presidents are they just concluded United Nations General Assembly, the 77th, United Nations General Assembly. Many of the heads of state, they pointed out that the West should stop, using and weaponizing human rights and freedom, because these human rights that are being weaponized, the people upon whom they are being weaponized upon, they are the ones who have suffered colonialism and slavery. They are not the ones who have been, Hitler was not in Africa. The most brutal violators of human rights have not been in Africa. They have come from Europe. They have been Europeans. So when they weaponize it, it becomes unfortunate. And these are the things which we have to resist, because the UN, to a very large extent, has become a dictatorial, an authoritarian organization that is being used by the powerful. It is not it should be a democratic organization that all states should vote equally. But it is an authoritarian organization being used by these guys who are authoritarian, going around the world destroying, at the same time, destroying people and killing people, and at the same time proclaiming how they are champions of human rights. And I think that as Africans, we need to check this. We need really to check this and hold these organizations and these groups, Europeans and the West, who are claiming that they are champions of human rights. Now, the African Union, I think that we have expectations from it, but its behavior has been unwanted, unwanted, really. If you look at even the situation in Burkina Faso and Mali, it is always towing the line of the imperialists. And this is very disappointing to us as Africans. When they are putting sanctions on Mali, the African Union is mentioning the same thing which the Europeans are mentioning, the same thing which ECOWAS is. And we know this is imperialistic, neo-colonial lines. And we wonder whether the people in that organization really understand what to do, whether they do analysis, whether they have read history, or they just wake up, from their sleep and they have not done anything and they just parrot whatever, the imperialists are saying. So this is where it becomes very problematic. This is where the African Union becomes very problematic, that it has not been instrumental in protecting the interests of the Africans on the ground, whether it is the people in Burkina Faso, in Guinea, whether it is in Ivory Coast, where Ouattara, a puppet, we know that this is a puppet president. And they supported, the African Union supported the installment of the puppet. It has continued to support the installment, puppet, and neo-colonial policies on the continent. So it becomes a problem. So I would say that what I expect the president, the Prime Minister Abiy right now to do, looking at the situation, how it is going, that the African Union is becoming dysfunctional. I see that the imperialists are trying to twist and interfere in how things were going, because they saw that if these negotiations go ahead, the Prime Minister was winning, because things were going the way Ethiopia had wanted them to go, that Africans are sitting down to discuss these matters by themselves. I expect now, what I would advise the Prime Minister Abiy is for him to intensify actually further the engagement on the continent. He has to cross now from the eastern part of the continent and go as far as, the west and the south of the continent, and mobilize the African continent. This is the only way I believe we will be able to push out these imperialists. So all of us, South Africa, and all the nations who have shown interest, who have shown that they want us as Africans to solve our issues, like Madame Naleda Pandor, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of South Africa. She made it very clear that we have to be able to do things how we want. You spoke about Russia visiting Ethiopia, Uganda, Central African Republic, and other countries. Egypt visited Egypt. So we need to be able to choose our own friends on this continent without these imperialists telling us, and these imperialists, jumping and hopping all over the continent. I think this is something also which has to be stopped. If the United States has embassies on the continent, let it be embassies in countries, not representative in the Horn of Africa, because the African continent is not a territory of the United States of Europe. So it cannot choose where it should have representatives. So I think that these are things which need to be very clear and firmly, but I would advise the Prime Minister to increase and intensify the engagement with the continent, because when you look at the East African region, I think that he has the support of the region, but he needs to to push further into the western part of the continent, the central part of the continent, and the southern part of the continent, and consolidate support for Ethiopia. And that voice, countries like Zimbabwe might go out there, and this voice should be used to ward off this interference, this foreign interference, this neo-colonial and imperialist interference in the continent, and how it wants to solve its conflicts on the continent.
Thank you. Thank you, Kwame. Coming back to Lambert, if I have to remind the question, first you can, of course, you can reflect on the, what has been said around what made change U.S. now to really to seek peace, or to give it, totally the issue in the ownership of the African Union. It's even ridiculous to talk like this. But anyway, yeah, that's one, you can reflect on that. Secondly, just repeating what I said. So we were all like on the brink. Okay, now finally, after a lot of consistency from the Ethiopia side, that this issue should be only led by, if it cannot be solved internally, then it should be the African Union. And then we say, okay, finally the African Union has taken, and then it was all quiet, and all of a sudden it bombarded us with that later, saying that these people are who's going to be included, and it's going to resume in South Africa. But that was just taken from us. I wouldn't say even from Ethiopia, from the citizens of the continent, that the ability of the African Union to solve, I wouldn't take it this thing as light as it is just an Ethiopian issue. The commission, the ability of the African Union to solve has been discredited just because of that later from Uhuru Kenyatta, who happens to be the son of Africa and the former president of Kenya. What would you say about that? You are muted. Okay, now it's good.
Thank you, Mahlet, again, and of course, Gwanza, for your insightful contribution. I think one takeaway that I would perhaps, just for a second, perhaps build on from what my comrade Gwanza said, is that, well, I'm going to rephrase it. In a sense, the peace talks in South Africa were a certain victory, not only for Ethiopia, but also for Africa. Because this is what we have been singing from the very beginning, that we want an African-led peace talks. And personally, it's been my opinion that this has never been in the interests of the West, because somehow they want to be part of it so that they're able to influence it to meet the interests of the West. Now, we were all, of course, excited that we're having peace talks that are being led by the African Union. And finally, we have the ideal of African solutions and to African problems. You know, one of the psychological weaknesses of the African Union is that it does not have a track record of resolving conflicts within Africa solely based on its own credentials. It has always been about you can be there, but the West has to be somewhere to do something for you. But this was going to be a game changer in the sense that it was purely going to be led by the African Union. And I think, and I want to give a benefit of doubt to the leadership of the African Union, that they themselves in this particular instance were interested in having only African people, having only African, actors within these peace talks. Now, how does the withdrawal of Uhuru give us a clue as to how much the West was not impressed by this element of having only Africans involved in these peace talks? I'll give you a clue. If you have read the letter that that President Uhuru wrote, in withdrawing, and before I get to that, I want to again also reveal rather that I think President Uhuru somehow got to be influenced by the West, in a sense that they thought you've got to muddy the water and make it difficult for it to proceed. If you read that letter, President Uhuru makes 2 points. One of the points he makes, is that he says there should be a cessation of hostilities. That is one. Then the second one, he says it needs to be clarified on the actors, the people who will be involved, in the peace talks or something like that. Now, those two things will, you need to look at it very critically. Let's handle it one by one. One, it says, let there be cessation of hostilities. Now, if I ask you a question, where has war been? Has war been when was the last time an Ethiopian soldier stepped on the soil of the Tigray region in Ethiopia? So the point is that there has been war outside Tigray. So if you're talking about cessation of hostilities, you should be telling the TPLF that can you stop fighting, not the government of Ethiopia, because they have never stepped back into Tigray ever since the war resumed. So the point is that what President Uhuru was doing was to regurgitate, to repeat the talking points of the TPLF and the West, which talking points are meant to make it impossible for the peace process to proceed. That is one. Number two, and this one is very interesting, where he asks to be clarified on the actors and the people who will be involved in the peace talks. Now, do you realize where it is an indirect way to put the African Union on the spotlight, to bring out and profess itself and say, we don't have the US, we don't have the Europeans in this thing, or we have them. Now, the point was actually, it was to put the African Union in the court of Western public opinion. Can you tell us, it is like saying, because it's more like the African Union had convened, the actors within these peace talks, and it didn't seem to have a strong presence of other forces outside Africa. Now, what the US and perhaps its allies decided to do was to get to Uhuru and say, we can't proceed with these peace talks without us, the US, being involved, without us, the non-Africans, being involved. Now, but how do we come in? We can't say, can you people involve us? Because that would be so plain, so much of plain interference. So the best, I believe, I may be wrong, of course, but I think to a big extent, I am right. They should have gotten to President Uhuru and said, can you bring it to the spotlight? Now, they have put the African Union in a difficult place. I'm telling you, before the next peace talks proceed, they have given also the TPLF another reason for which to refuse to participate in the peace talks. Because they're going to say, can you tell us beforehand which people are going to be involved? I thought the people who are involved, it was already clear. President Uhuru, Comrade Obasanjo, and other African actors. Why then are you asking for clarification? Because you want to put the African Union on the spotlight to say we have Obasanjo, we have this, and then when you do that, you give the TPLF an excuse to say you can't have only that. Can we have other people involved or something like that? So in a sense, they put a roadblock on these peace talks using a technical matter of the people who are involved. In any case, for what reason how does knowing who else is involved anyhow help President Uhuru, in proceeding with his part of the peace talks? So that gives you an indicator that the US and the non-Africans, let me call them the non-Africans, have a big stake in these peace talks. And like I said at the beginning, when I casted doubt on what I'm thinking, that what has changed in this thing to eventually interest the US that they should have peace, I have said at the beginning that the peace talks are only going to proceed if the eventuality states that the outcome of the election of the peace talks is in the interest of the US. And how can it be in the interest of the US? It can only be in the interest of the US in a sense that it keeps the TPLF alive. Because I believe, and I want to look forward, that the best possible outcome that not only the government of Ethiopia would want from the peace talks, but also the best possible outcome that Africans would want from the peace talks, is that one of the warring forces should be disarmed. That one of the forces in this, and that's the TPLF, should not have the capacity to resume hostilities even after peace talks. That for me should be the ideal on the side of the government of Ethiopia, and even of any other African who is interested. It is only a non-African who would want the TPLF to remain with the capacity to resume hostilities at the drop of a needle at some point again in future. So the peace talks, for me, if they are to end in the interest of Ethiopia and Africa, would mean that one of the two warring forces should be disarmed and not have the capacity to resume war at some point again. And that can only be the TPLF, because it can't be the government of Ethiopia, because the government of Ethiopia represents the interests of Ethiopia as a country, of which Tigray is simply a region. Now, who wouldn't want that? It is the US. Who wouldn't want that kind of outcome? It is the West, the non-Africans. And there is no way they are going to enforce and avoid that from happening if they are not part of the peace talks. Now you begin to see why these peace talks, I can assure you, will keep hitting a snag. I suspect even in the next resumption, I do not think, I highly doubt that it is going to work out. In a sense, if it proceeds, it is going to get stuck on the way. Somehow, you will have the TPLF getting involved because they must play to the gallery, pretend to show that they're interested in the peace talks. But when they see that the condition of having non-Africans, particularly having a key part in influencing the direction of the peace talks, has not been met, they're going to withdraw midway the peace talks. I do not believe that it is in the interest of the non-Africans to have the conflict in Ethiopia arrive at a peaceful conclusion. I do not believe that it's in the interest of the US to have the TPLF completely in a position where they are unable to resume fighting, to resume the pressure on the government of Ethiopia at any one point. I believe it is in the interest of non-Africans to have this war go for a pause, to allow the rebuilding of the armories within Tigray. I believe it's in the interest of the non-Africans to have the TPLF get breathing space to resume fighting at some point, so long as the other side, that is the government of Ethiopia, does not become subservient to the interests of the West. I can assure you, I do not believe that so much has changed. I do not believe that the US believes now it is good time for peace, because they didn't want it in the first place. I have said this from the word go, from the very beginning, that it is in the interest of the US that war continues in Ethiopia. I don't think that they would want peace to return. But even in that instance, of course, as my brother Kwame said, so what do we do with respect to that? Of course, we continue to engage as Africans. We continue to demand and pray and hope and require that the war in Ethiopia comes to a conclusion. Everybody wants that. You know, I keep thinking and saying that, you know, one of the things, I think last week when President Ruto was in Ethiopia, he made mention, you know, reference to the president, I mean, to the Prime Minister of Ethiopia as a genius. And I made one of the comments and said that if you look at what the Prime Minister of Ethiopia has done in the space of 1 year since the war, actually, I think he has done more during between the time that the war has been, more than he did before even that. I mean, he has put up about a public library, and something the guide is running. The production within Ethiopia is high. The point I'm trying to make here, Mahlet, is that there is so much progress going on in Ethiopia. Even in the midst of war, you can't imagine how much progress would be there if there was peace.
Definitely.
Now, with the direction that the Prime Minister of Ethiopia has already given Ethiopia, which means that he's able to do this not only without depending purely on the West, but also to do it even when he is being fought by the West. How much more would the West be motivated to ensure that there is conflict in Ethiopia? Do you really think that under those circumstances, the West would finally wake up and say, okay, fine, you are not listening to us, you're not bending to us, but also we are fighting you and you're still succeeding, so let's have peace? I do not think so. I think it is in the interest of the West to continue to have war in Ethiopia. And thinking of perhaps again explaining why we think that this conflict continues. The withdrawal of Uhuru, for me, I have said this, and I've said this publicly, is the US and the non-Africans have a hand in it. Also, in large part because you remember, like I've just said, the president of Kenya, Ruto, was in Ethiopia last week, and he praised the Prime Minister of Ethiopia. What that means psychologically when it comes to negotiations is that you have one of the parties, one of the actors in this peace negotiation, being praised by a president who has appointed somebody to go and negotiate, I mean, and take part in these negotiations. What does that mean? It's a fait accompli. What it means is that President Ruto has acknowledged that there is one constant in this whole episode, and that is the government and the Prime Minister of Ethiopia. That no matter what happens, the Prime Minister of Ethiopia will remain the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, and that his interests must be taken as first and as a priority because he represents the interests of Ethiopia as a country. Now, you must notice that this is not the same line of thinking that the West has. It is not the same line of thinking that the US would want. So, and yet you're seeing the person that has been appointed by a president who has already committed himself to declaring that one side of the conflict is a constant in this, is going to be the one mediating this. And the US knows it does not have a hand and will not directly influence this. It is very obvious that the only thing they're going to do is frustrate the peace talks. I am not surprised that these peace talks have been frustrated, and I much fear, and I think that the government of Ethiopia has to be more careful as we go forward, because now I think that if I'm to prophesy, I foresee this. If the peace talks are to resume, I foresee them resuming only on account of the AU accepting to become subservient to the interests of the West. They can only resume if we see the non-Africans having a stronger influence on these peace talks. And if that becomes the case, then it beats the very foundation upon which we are trying to build these peace talks, that we should have an African solution to an African problem that has been fostered by the African Union.
Thank you very much for that, Lambert. Really, quite well explained all around. Really, I was going to ask, really, what do you think have triggered Uhuru to come in the last minute and cancel this? You know, when we know that Ruto has told the world in front of Al Jazeera that he has appointed Uhuru for this peace talk negotiation, and then nothing has been said, and just one day before to come and to tell us what is my mandate, I have pulled out, and for some silly reason saying that due to prior engagement. This is not something that it's a personal issue. We are talking about where people are dying. It's about stopping a conflict. And we lost our brother Kwame. Perhaps he will come back, but this would be my last question for you. You know, in prior discussions that we have on this platform before, you say, you know, we talked about how the West really consistently is discrediting the ability of the African Union to do anything. But Ethiopia, I would say, you know, not because I'm an Ethiopian, but we all have witnessed, took that weight on her shoulder and tried to show the African Union by being, you know, a political sacrifice on this issue during the GERD, and also now that telling the African Union that it has a mandate, but also it has the capacity to do so. But now this once again, the door has been slammed on our face, you know, by, okay, there is a West behind it. There is all of it evidences, but the one who came out in front, you know, in public and who told us is the son of Africa. What is the future? I mean, for this, the West will continue what it is doing, but with to be, you know, such plans, such big things to be sabotaged by our own people. What do you say about that?
Mahlet, the sabotage of Africa, you heard before that in the imperial times when we were colonized, the white man was able to police us by himself, by being in Africa. It is also said that he's living, he didn't exactly live, but he left behind colonial clerks, people who act, you know, on behalf of him. What does that say? It means that they usually play into the interests, the individual selfishness of us Africans to divide us and bring confusion and still try to manipulate and roll us from without Africa. And I think that is the case here. Even during the years of his presidency, I always thought that President Uhuru Kenyatta of Kenya was somewhat, in most cases, serving the interests of the West. Of course, perhaps not for his personal interests, but also maybe for his selfish interests, which we're looking at Kenya only, only Kenya as a country, but missing the broader picture of Africa as a continent. And this is what the West does. It throws before you, a particular gain that serves your personal interest and the interest of the country that you represent, and asks you in that respect to betray the aspirations of the continent and of the African people as a race. You know, this is how they have kept Africa divided. They come to a country and they make you believe that your interests are the best. And it still reflects back on how they were able to put borders on African countries. You know, if you read back so well into history, you will know that we never had these borders. You know, there was no border between Uganda and Kenya. We were always one community. It is the Europeans who gave us these borders. The idea was to make us believe more in what we have been clustered as a small group within a country, and not to look at the broader picture of a continent. Now, this is what happens. They reach out to an individual and influence him as a person and try to influence him on the basis of only his country. This is a problem that has not begun with Uhuru Kenyatta. It's a problem that dates way back to so many people. You remember in Congo, they went and killed Patrice Lumumba, but using Mobutu. In so many other countries, they use the very same people to betray the interests of their country and of a continent. Even right now in Ethiopia, you see it is very obvious that they're trying to force a particular narrative against Ethiopia in terms of its human rights records. So what they do is they pick a Kenyan, they pick a black face, and they want to use them to be the ones to own up to concocted results. They concoct their own findings. They have a predetermined, conclusion, but they want an African face to own it up so that it appears like it has a sense of legitimacy. This is what's happening throughout Africa. It is an entrenched problem, which I think will take a lot of conscious building. It will take a lot of Africans, finding a way to insulate themselves from this. And I think, again, this is where Ethiopia is taking initiative in leading the continent. I like to say this, and sometimes people think it's because I like Ethiopia. I don't like Ethiopia, but I see beneath the surface of what Ethiopia as a country and its leadership is doing in awakening Africa as a continent. Do you know that the insistence on African solutions for African problems is not just of benefit only to Ethiopia? It is trying to build a mindset that supersedes even Ethiopia. It is trying to say that African Union, you have the capacity to solve problems within Africa. It is trying to say that African Union, you have the manpower, you have the capacity, you have the mandate to solve problems within Africa. Can you accept to embrace your responsibility? Because it is useless to have African Union if African Union does not embrace its responsibility. It becomes like a force that is being used by the West to manage Africa. And I think that's what the African Union has been for a while. They use it to manage us. Now, what Ethiopia is saying is, can you play your part? The mandate is yours. The mandate to oversee, peace negotiations is yours. Can you do it? It is by coincidence that Ethiopia is doing this and presenting itself as the subject of this experiment in Africa. Experiment of the African Union managing to oversee a peaceful negotiation. Ethiopia has put itself as a subject. There is war in Ethiopia. Can you do it with us? Can you, African Union, come and negotiate for us without involving the West? The first time it did that was with the GAD. They wanted to get involved. Ethiopia said we can only have the African Union involved in the mediation of this conflict and this disagreement between Ethiopia and Egypt. Remember that time? And somehow, what happened? Haven't we seen it through? Somehow we found common ground. Somehow Egypt had its frustrations, but I think that even if Egypt isn't so happy, somehow we see that the GAD has been a success. And I've been following a bit of news in Egypt. They seem to be coming to terms with it and to even see it as of benefit even to Egypt. So somehow a solution has been found. That is one track record. That is one tick in the long list of things that the African Union is capable of doing. In the long list of things that Africans are capable of doing on their own without the influence and the interference of the West. So what Ethiopia is doing is actually giving Africa a new psychology. What Ethiopia is doing is giving Africa a new sense of understanding, a new kind of awakening that we can solve problems on our own, and we are presenting ourselves as the subject of this experiment. This is what the West does not want. And so here in comes Uhuru Kenyatta. The West is trying a time-tested formula of trying to influence an individual to become their stooge within Africa and to ensure that this kind of ideal where we solve our own problems as ourselves does not come to pass. I don't know what the future holds. I don't know what will happen as we move forward, but it is within the consciousness of the African people. It is within the interest of the African people that whether or not Uhuru Kenyatta, if he accepts to play the part in the script that the US and the West has written, in a sense that they would not want us to solve our problems as Africans. And if he does not want to present himself as one of the champions of Africa, who becomes the faces of those who manage to oversee, a peace process of a war, the very first I would assume that is purely, mediated by Africans. If he does not want to be part of that historic process, then perhaps he can pull out and have somebody else who is interested in that. Of course, I'm so sure that the US and its partners are going to try their best to make sure that that doesn't happen. But again, like I said, depending on how much there is a new sense of understanding and awakening within the African Union, we must be able to hold our ground and ensure that if we are going to enter peace negotiations, we cannot have the West police us. When shall we grow up? Even if they were teaching us what to do, when shall we begin to do things on our own as Africans? I mean, at some point, even if it's a child and you're training a child, there has to be a point of graduation. When shall we graduate? 60 years. Yesterday, Uganda celebrated independence. It is over 60 years. If we say we still need the West to tell us what to do, when shall we say we're now mature enough to do things on our own? Of course, I don't believe that they even need to train us, because before the Westerners and the imperialists came to Africa, we were managing our own affairs. We had mechanisms for solving our own problems. We had mechanisms we would fight and we would find answers to our own solutions. How then does the West come and begin to tell us on how we should solve our problems, unless they have their own solutions and their own interests that they want to impose on us? So I think that we can only sit down. Ethiopia should only sit down on the negotiating table, provided the mediation and those who are going to be involved in this peace negotiation is purely African. I do not think, and I believe that the Ethiopia would do itself in Africa a very big disservice. It would be going back so many steps backwards if it accepts to engage in peace talks that involve the non-Africans to a greater extent. I think that going forward, they have set precedent. They have set the precedent and said that we need this to be a purely African affair. Going forward in the next 1, 2 days, 1 week, or 1 month, if we are going to resume these peace talks, they must be premised on the very original thinking that it must be a purely African affair. If they want to involve Westerners, then I believe perhaps the Ethiopia and Africa need to look at how to come together and reign on the TPLF, whether it's militarily or through the negotiating table.
Thank you very much, Lambert, for that. I totally 1000% agree with you that Ethiopia has already set the precedent. As I said, it has been this political sacrifice by putting itself, as you said, as an experiment, and we won, although it's not 100% solved, but we won with a GERD, and same example should be followed by the African Union to solve this conflict. So Ethiopia really, as an Ethiopian, but also more importantly, as an African, it's really my hope and also our duty to advocate that the Ethiopian government should continue sticking to the principle of African solution to African problems. It's not only because the benefit of the Ethiopian people, but it's also, it has that responsibility for Africa and for the global Black people to show that we can own and we can do our own affairs. We can own our own affairs, just like that we have been before they wrote our history, before slavery, before colonialism. So yeah, with that, I would like to end. Thank you very much, Lambert, really, for your service. So anything less, what Uhuru Kenyatta did, I really would say this, I will say this publicly. It's a disservice for Africa. Really, it's a disservice for Africa. Whatever drift they have, whatever, it's totally not only to Ethiopia, or even, I don't know if it's a personal problem with it. It's a disservice for whole Africa. And Ethiopia also should stick anything less. Ethiopia has set the bar. If Ethiopia really involves little, whether it is Russia or the West or middle, whatever, it should be totally an African affair. Anything less will be a disservice to Africa. So Yeah. Thank you very much, Lambert.
All right, Mahlet. Yeah, you're welcome. Till next
Yeah,
time.
so tomorrow, just for our audience, we will have Lambert again and others. We are going to talk about what happened in the 51st meeting of the Human Rights Council in Geneva, where at the end, unfortunately, they have adopted to renew the mandate of the so-called International Commission on for Human Rights experts on Ethiopia. And that's unfortunate, but there's always an opportunity in challenge. What we have seen is really a milestone for Africa, where all African countries have united their voice and have actually voted no. I mean, I wouldn't say in support of Ethiopia, because they have realized that this is much of politics, or something else than a human right issue, where it's the only country from the represented African countries that abstained was Malawi. So we will celebrate and also talk about what's next, how can we capitalize on this. Lambert will be one of the speakers amongst other Africans, so please join us tomorrow and be a family. And bye bye. Thank you, Lambert, again. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.